Kathleen Culler. Welcome to Hopkinton's Attic, the show where we take a look at what's in the collections at the Hopkinton History Center, the museum curated by the Hopkinton Historical Society on Hayden Row Street. Today we'll find out how one Hopkinton farmer dug up the dirt and led us to discover residents who were here 7,000 years ago. And we'll hear about modern-day sleuths Ron Yankee and Linda Connolly and their efforts to preserve a collection of artifacts for our town's study and enjoyment. Our story begins with farmer Harry Cheney, who worked his 126-acre farm in the Bear Hill area of Hopkinton over 100 years ago, along what we know today as School Street. Having moved to Hopkinton from Milford to farm, Cheney found many Native American tools, cutting edges, knife points, tips, and axes as he worked his land, often finding several artifacts in the same field. Cheney's collection grew and was passed on to his son Henry, who operated an amateur museum that was noticed in its day. The family was well known in the neighborhood.
There were many Cheneys who lived in the Woodville section of the town. Very remarkable, unusual, and self-educated, self-taught family. He's principally remembered now for his archaeological work and for his collecting also of rocks, so work with geology. But in the 20s and the 30s, he collected all types of Native American artifacts, and he had a little museum in Woodville.
Henry's sons, Ora, William, and Curtis, took on the museum next, with Ora eventually presiding over the collection and often selling and trading off parts of it until he died in 1991. After Ora died, the gradual decline of the property accelerated. In 2015, the Hopkinton Historical Commission met to discuss the demolition of the original cottage, by now deemed unstable, and news articles covered the crumbling of the original farmhouse and surrounding buildings. The Cheney estate gave to the Hopkinton Historical Society what remained of Ora's collection of artifacts, and volunteers stepped in to secure the collection. The effort was led by Hopkinton Historical Society member Ron Yankee, who retrieved many boxes of artifacts from the attic of the property's cottage just before its demolition. With the boxes rescued from the cottage, it was now time to figure out the significance of what was in them, and that job fell to Linda Connolly. Many of us recognize Connolly because she works at the Hopkinton Public Library. But few of us realize that Connolly is also a trained archivist, and she's the one who keeps the history straight at the Hopkinton History Center, the museum maintained by the Hopkinton Historical Society on Hayden Row Street. Connolly recognized that the Cheney collection needed to be examined by an archaeologist, a level of expertise that the Hopkinton Historical Society had never sought before. Working with the volunteers at the History Center, Connolly looked for funding for this new endeavor and for the right archaeologist to head up the cataloging work ahead. According to Ann Mattina, president of the Historical Society, the group was successful with both funding and in finding the right archaeologist.
Linda found for us Dr. Eric Johnson and his archaeological group at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She found him while looking for someone who might be able to help us identify what we actually had in the Cheney collection. And she determined that this was Dr. Johnson and his group. It's mostly graduate students who work with him out of UMass. Were a very reputable group of folks who could do exactly what we needed them to do, to go through these boxes of Native American artifacts and help us figure out what we had, what their purpose was to the natives who used the materials, and date the material for us and help us organize it as well. So Linda and I, several years ago, went to the Community Preservation Committee here in Hopkinton and requested funding for hiring Professor Johnson and his students to do just that. And we were granted the money to do so by the town through a very generous grant from the CPC and the citizens of Hopkinton.
Today, the Hopkinton History Center has a collection that historians can unpack and use to supplement their study of the history of our region. It's fascinating to see the order that has been brought to what looked like boxes of rocks, and the information that emerges about the age of the artifacts, when they must have been made. That glorious detail is nothing less than shocking. Let's look at an item that was collected by Kurt Cheney in 1936.
They're telling us here that these are described on page 3, and here is page 3. So this is showing you the contents of this bag. And there also is a description of what they're made of, the date range, approximate when it is known. A lot of times there is no date, and any notes, anything that might be interest in particular about that item. So page 3, number 23, is this elongated item. Oh, and this one has one of Harry's, or Aura's, I think probably Harry though, one of his labels. And it is called an Orient fishtail. And if I'm pronouncing it correctly, it's made of rhyolite. And its date range, which is approximate, give or take a few hundred or 1,000 years, 2,500 to 4,000 years old. And this one, in little handwriting, I wish we had more of the original labels, is indicated that it's an arrow point and that it was located or found north of Pratt Pond in Upton, Massachusetts, by Kurt, May 14th, 1936. So it's really important that that label remains with this tip.
The age of the artifacts has been a surprise for all the volunteers at the Hopkinton History Center.
One of the first things we had Dr. Johnson do was obviously come to the building, take a look at what we had, and he expressed to Linda at that time that some of these were incredibly old, and anywhere from 5,000 to 6,000 years old. And Linda said, do you think that these are, she asked Dr. Johnson, do you think that these are from the Nipmucs, which is obviously a tribe that many of us are familiar with in this area? And he said, no, I think they're from the Nipmucs' ancestors.
We were able to verify that most likely most of them are from Hopkinton and the general vicinity, and that they are much older than anyone, a novice, would assume, that they range between 2,000 and in a couple of cases 8,000 years old.
Volunteers at the History Center also have had a revision in their vocabulary. Most of us grew up learning that Native Americans created arrowheads. Connolly now has learned the correct terminology and its significance for the particular set of artifacts in Hopkinton.
What I learned from talking to Eric Johnson is that it's incorrect to refer to these as arrowheads, that the technology used in creating these materials came way before the use of bow and arrow and what we think of as Native American as a hunting tool, bow and arrow. These came long before that, and they would have been attached to some sort of a wooden handle, and they're knife tips or spear tips or points. So they're referred to as points, not arrowheads, because that suggests something very different and more recent.
Dr. Johnson also showed Connolly that the craftsmanship and technique used by the people who created the tips and points was unique and authentic.
And Eric told me, too, that this is if a person today were given the same type of stone and given equipment to carve it in a similar way, that this would take incredible skill and that it's a piece of art. We couldn't do this. People could not do this today. That is one thing that archaeologists, they try to replicate the work, and it's a difficult task.
Acquiring the Cheney collection had raised questions about Oracini's penchant for trading and selling off parts of his museum in the years before his death in 1991. There were suggestions that some of the artifacts had been picked up on family vacations out west. And we know by looking at news articles and checking in with people in town who knew Ora that he regularly held yard sales and swap meets. So as an archivist, Connolly wondered if Dr. Johnson would consider the collection too diminished or not significant enough to warrant an academic investigation.
Maybe they were not locally found. Maybe they're common and just not worthy of all of the time and effort that it would take. You know, how good a collection is this? And I think he was surprised. The fact that over time this has been sitting in an attic for at least 30 years, 25, 30 years, that there's a good number of them, that they are representative of materials that were found in this area, and that they are ancient, and that they are proof and evidence of people who lived in our town, in Hopkinton, Upton, and the area thousands of years ago. But I think it was a treat for them to come across as an extensive collection that hadn't been analyzed, hadn't been studied. So everybody's lucky that they're still here.
General pride. That's in abundance with the Cheney collection. The origin of the artifacts right here on land known as School Street has created a lot of interest for the History Center volunteers. Connolly summarizes the opinion of the members of the Hopkinton Historical Society and the volunteers who work in the History Center.
We don't have a lot of documentation about where in Hopkinton or Upton or Milford, etc. they were found, but the stones and the style of the carvings determine or definitely match up with the idea that they are local, which makes them significant to us. It's our stuff. It's Hopkinton stuff.
The volunteers are also proud as the Cheney collection takes its place among bodies of information in our area and in Metro West Massachusetts.
I think that it's really important to the citizens of Hopkinton and the surrounding area to know and to understand the lives of the indigenous people who were here prior to the settling of the Metro West area, if you will, by white settlers. There were whole societies here before we came, and understanding who they were and how they lived helps us understand ourselves better.
As we wrap up this episode, I'd like to thank all the volunteers at the Hopkinton Historical Society for working to preserve our town's history, which you can discover by visiting the museum on Hayden Row Street. And I hope that you have enjoyed this look at the Cheney collection. I'm Kathleen Culler. Thank you for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you again in Hopkinton's Attic.